to understand this balancing act that has to go on between prejudicial effect and probative value, let's look at some actual examples, right? We already understand the facts or testimony or video footage or whatever it is that would have a prejudicial effect. That means it would distort people's perception of the party, independent of the actual facts of the specific case, will be excluded unless the probative value outweighs the prejudicial effect. So it's got to prove something. It's got to be really central to proving these important facts. If it makes the other side look bad, that's okay, as long as it's outweighed by how important it is to proving those facts. But if it only proves the facts a little bit and it really makes the other side look bad while doing it, then it's probably not going to be allowed in. Okay, this is a case from 1979. It's a criminal case, the Crown versus Cloutier. And Cloutier was a guy who was being accused of importing marijuana. The prosecution wanted to enter evidence that had been seized at his mom's home in his basement. The evidence showed that Mr. Cloutier really loved marijuana. It included a poem that he wrote about how great marijuana is. It included 3 pipes that didn't have any actual marijuana, and just residue, hints, traces, and a metric scale, right? A digital metric scale. So all these are things that kind of show a bit about his lifestyle, but he's not being accused of possession of marijuana, right? He's not being accused of using marijuana. He's being accused of importing marijuana. So these things are connected to marijuana in various ways, but the court decides that there's not enough of a direct connection to the facts central to the case. It doesn't show anything about whether he would import marijuana. So they say that it's not allowed in. They say it's not admissible if its only purpose to prove that the accused, Mr. Cloutier here, is the type of guy who would likely commit this crime that he's being charged with. The evidence that they're trying to bring in is just trying to raise suspicions without really establishing facts, and because of this, the court says you can't let it in. All right, let's look at another case. This is from 1983, another criminal case, the case of the Crown versus Morris. And in the case of the Crown versus Morris, it was a case dealing with importation, not of marijuana, but of heroin. And in this case, when they searched Morris's apartment, they found a newspaper article that he'd cut out in the newspaper about the heroin trade moving to Pakistan. And they wanted to introduce this in evidence. And the court found that it was evidence that really only raised the issue of his character or his propensities, him being the type of guy who would commit the crime. And if it's about him being the type of guy who would commit the crime, that's just prejudicial effect. It's not really directly proving the central facts about, in this specific case, do we have evidence about him actually directly importing on this day at this time this specific quantity of heroin? Because that excluded, no good. Seaboyer is, again, a third criminal case. This one's a little more complicated. And Seaboyer actually went back and forth between the criminal case and the House of Commons. Like, laws were written because of this case. So the story involved a woman who was testifying in a sexual assault case in which she had suffered bruises. And so the defense was trying to argue that even though this woman had bruises on her arms, like, the defense wasn't arguing that the two didn't engage in a sexual encounter. The defense was trying to say, just because she's got bruises, that's not evidence of sexual assault. Now, as part of their defense, what they wanted to enter into evidence was testimony from other people in the town who knew the woman and were going to testify that she had a history of liking rough sexual encounters with other people in town, and that this was part of a prior sexual history that included her being bruised in other consensual cases. Now, the defense was trying to convince the jury that she had consented to bruising in the past, and therefore that just because she had bruises this time shouldn't be held against Mr. Seaboyer, because this is just normally how she proceeds. Now, a lot of people would consider this to be relevant to the theory of the defense, right? If we're supposed to believe her version of the facts or his version of the facts, then this evidence about other sexual encounters involving consensual bruising is going to be significant. But Parliament had already enacted a section of the Criminal Code which, for policy reasons, had wanted to make it easier for people to testify in sexual assault cases, because there's a long history, and this is ongoing, unfortunately, where it's very, very difficult to testify in sexual assault cases. It's very embarrassing. Often we've seen this in the last calendar year in Quebec. There's 2 high-profile cases where There were acquittals in sexual assault cases, and the person who testified was very embarrassed from the whole thing, didn't even result in a conviction. And so because of this, because Parliament wanted to encourage people to be less reluctant to testify despite the things that can happen in court, they wanted to put a shield in place to protect people's previous sexual past from being brought up. Because if we go back decades before this, then that was the main defense technique, was to get the person on the stand and try and drag up every sordid detail of their sexual past. Now, the problem here in Seaboyer is that even though you have this shield in place to try to protect people who are just getting ripped apart on the stand when they have the bravery to come and testify, now you have somebody in a case where, well, this probably actually would be really relevant information. And the Supreme Court agreed. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that because this specific evidence was relevant and probative to the specific case, the section of the criminal code was getting in the way of somebody's right to a fair trial, and this was unconstitutional under the Charter. So a new trial was ordered so that the evidence which had been excluded at the trial could be used. And the Parliament responded to this by rewriting the criminal code to try and shape the law in a way that was indeed constitutional. So you had this back and forth between the courts and Parliament.